there are lots of intersecting issues in this area. And I just wanted to draw on a couple of examples before I come on to say why the Refugee Convention doesn't really help us, to kind of illustrate how it can. Because it's wrong to say that someone who is displaced from their country of origin and part of that relates to climate will not achieve protection. It's just more complicated. There's an intersectionality in relation to the reasons why people move. I think in lots of different cases, it's not a single identifiable factor, but that's particularly so in the context of climate. What I thought was easier to do rather than explaining the kind of principle is to think of a couple of examples, not from the UK courts, but in international courts, about where it has been established that climate is a relevant factor. And one very interesting case was from the Italian court in Florence. And it was a Pakistani victim of trafficking who is accepted as being kind of lower income in Pakistan and reliant on farming. He was a victim of trafficking, was brought to Italy. And in the context of his claim, the court was looking at whether he had a risk of re-trafficking if he returned to Pakistan because of his vulnerability as someone who was reliant on the land and degradation in his home area. And so it was that interlinking factor of a lack of livelihood, social instability, and being part of a marginalised group that led the court to say, well, actually, yes, you are at increased risk of re-trafficking, and therefore you have protection under the convention. Another case that maybe also gives a good illustration of how other factors in trafficking people who are marginalised, this gives us some additional points to think about how all factors interlink, was a case in New Zealand about an Eritrean elderly couple. And in the context of Eritrea, the court was looking at the lack of efforts made on the behalf of the government to protect older people, so more vulnerable people, with the effects of climate change leading to a lack of sustainable housing. And the court said, well, yes, this was a protection claim that came within the Refugee Convention, both because of climate impacting on age and vulnerability, but also because the Eritrean government hadn't put adequate measures in place to respond to all sections of the population in the context of a changing climate. And I hope those give you an idea as to how it's a range of different factors that can either increase vulnerability or can mean that people are impacted in a different way by the effects of climate. But as I say, that gives us examples of successes, but fair to say that quite a substantial number of people who are forced to cross an international border as a result of climate change may not fall inside those categories. And I don't want to deal with this in a lot of detail, but maybe just to give you a couple of reasons why. As you may all know, under the Refugee Convention, someone is entitled to protection if they have a well-founded fear of persecution on the grounds of either their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And what is required to make out a claim in that context is a kind of human agency of persecution. So think then to a community who's displaced by flooding, where there isn't human agency in terms of the natural, the disaster and event, but there can be human agency where, for example, that leads to inter-ethnic conflict, something for that example. But it becomes a slightly more complex assessment for the courts to make that says, well, this doesn't actually sound like a refugee claim at all. Another problem, I think, which is why the Refugee Convention and therefore international law doesn't necessarily help us, is the fact that the majority of countries employ a standard that if you are able to seek protection in your country of origin, you're not entitled to protection in another state. And that makes, because yes, it's correct, and we may come on to some examples of this, some countries uniformly are affected by climate change. One thinks about kind of small island nation type examples. But in other cases, that may be harder for people to establish that, that they couldn't reasonably move internally. So as I say, it's a route for some people in certain cases, but it's definitely not a complete answer to a tangible protection framework that is understood and people can rely on. So what do we do? And I think, as Juliet said at the outset, this is not a new issue. This is something that's been debated for decades. I don't have an answer. I don't think there is a clear answer. But probably why events like this are so important is to kind of bring together a range of perspectives and look across different, whether it's campaigning, policy, law, to see what could be achieved. And one option, of course, could be we amend the refugee protection framework. We bring climate refugees within that framework. I think that would be unachievable. There are 145 states, I think of the 146 of the 195 countries who sign up to the Refugee Convention, so a large majority. But if one was going to look internationally about how we amend the international protection framework, you would need a huge global consensus. My view is that is unrealistic. I mean, of course, there is precedent for this. I think often people forget that the 1951 Refugee Convention, at its inception, only protected European people who were displaced in the context of World War II. It was only in 1967 that internationally everyone said, well, no, that geographical and temporal limitation is wrong, and it will extend across the world. So we see that there are examples of kind of radical reform, but I think we are in a very different place than we were in 1969. There are other areas, kind of other regions of the world that have a different approach. And I think quite interesting to think that the Global South, as we've said, are the main recipients of the brunt of climate change. But actually, in Africa and the Americas region, they do have a more expansive refugee definition that accommodates climate change. It allows for protection for people who have been displaced due to serious breakdown of public order. And so that can be your drought, your famine leading to land disputes. That makes you a refugee in Africa and the Americas. So that is an option. But as I say, I'm not sure that either we would have the political will in the UK, nor would we likely to have the political will more broadly. And knowing what I think everyone in this room knows about the extent to which refugees and those seeking asylum are already scapegoated, potentially expanding a definition is likely to dilute protection for all and therefore not achieve a purpose. And importantly, I think where things fall down, and I think Asad's going to touch on this, is that what we're talking about in the refugee framework is the protection for people who are forced to move. But maybe we should be conceiving the issue differently. Maybe we should be looking at assisting people to stay in their home areas, so focusing on that before people are forced to flee and take very dangerous journeys. So there are other options. One could look at safe and legal routes. Those of us who work a lot on immigration kind of in the legal or advice context find that phrase infuriating because it's the government response, people should come by safe and legal routes. The reality is there are very few, but we've seen from the, I think it's 180,000 Ukrainians, the 250,000 nationals from Hong Kong, we are able to offer routes if we need to. So an option, rather than formalizing something in an international or even a regional framework, maybe to get, this maybe through policy and advocacy, get the UK government to a position that it would be willing to open these types of exceptional short-term temporary stay visas, humanitarian visas, to help people who have been displaced in the short term. As I say, it's not a kind of clear and straightforward answer, but there are some options. I just wanted to end on giving you some pointers of kind of positivity, because I feel like often we talk in such a negative sense, but we are seeing after years and years, and decades and decades, of there not being much in terms of development of something overarching about state obligations to those in the context of climate change. We now actually have three developments which are in international courts or tribunals. So the Inter-American Court, the International Court of Justice, and the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea are all looking at this issue at the moment. And although migration, kind of displacement, is not a core focus, in the Inter-American Court, for example, there have been wide-ranging submissions on what state obligations are in the context of migration. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees have put forward really interesting position. And what's hoped is that the courts at international level might give states guidance as to what they can do individually to start to develop a framework, whether that's then modified regionally or by specific countries. So there are some routes, some potential tentative progress that I take as a kind of positive development. But as I say, the law is, at its present stage inadequate. It's not impossible, but definitely we're in a position of potential change with developments in the coming years.